Welcome back to LexTalks. Legal topic simplified. As a law student in India, you're diving into a world of complex legal concepts.
Yeah.
And today we're tackling one that's absolutely crucial for anyone aspiring to be a legal eagle. Liability of the state.
It is fascinating, this area. Really, we're going to sort of untangle the evolution of sovereign immunity, explore how the state can be held liable in contracts and torts, and even have a look at how India's approach compares globally.
And this isn't just about acing your exams, right? This
Mhm.
is about grasping that really delicate balance between the power of the state and the rights of individuals in a democracy.
Absolutely. Understanding how citizens can seek redress when their rights are violated,
Right.
and how the courts have shaped this evolving landscape.
Yeah, we'll even be discussing a particularly intriguing case from the 1990s.
Oh, nice.
That really highlights how India is reinterpreting this age-old concept of sovereign immunity.
Okay.
But first, let's go back to the basics. The Doctrine of Sovereign Immunity. The king can do no wrong. It sounds a bit archaic, doesn't it?
It does, and its roots are indeed in those historical notions of absolute monarchy. Back then, sovereign immunity meant the state was completely shielded from lawsuits.
So imagine this.
Hmm.
You're living in ancient times, and the state, let's say a king, wrongs you in some way. You had absolutely no legal recourse.
That was the prevailing idea.
Wow.
But thankfully, legal systems, much like societies, evolve. Over time, as the concept of individual rights gained traction, this absolute immunity of the state started to be questioned.
So how did this shift happen in India? Was there a specific event or case that triggered it?
Even during British rule, there were cracks in this absolute immunity.
Oh, okay.
The P&O steam navigation coast case, for instance, was a turning point. The courts held that the East India Company, while acting on behalf of the Crown, wasn't entirely sovereign when engaging in commercial activities
Okay.
and could therefore be sued.
That's interesting. So even back then, there was a recognition that the state shouldn't have a free pass for everything it does,
Yeah.
especially when acting more like a business.
Precisely. And this distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign functions of the state remains key even today.
Now, fast forward to post-independence India. Article 300 of our Constitution talks about the state being suable, right?
Yes, it states that the government of India can be sued in the name of the Union and the states by their respective names.
Okay.
But hold on, this doesn't mean sovereign immunity vanish overnight.
So it's more nuanced than that.
Much more. While Article 300 opens the possibility of legal action against the state,
Right.
the concept of sovereign immunity is still very much alive, particularly when we're talking about actions considered core functions of the state.
Okay. I'm seeing how this can get tricky. Can you give me an example of how this sovereign function defense has been used?
Certainly. Look at the Kasturi Lalralia Ram Jain case from 1965.
Okay.
The Supreme Court held that the state couldn't be held liable for the loss of gold seized by the police,
Okay.
as policing was considered a sovereign function.
So even if there was negligence, let's say the police weren't careful enough in storing the seized goods, the state could escape responsibility simply by claiming it was performing a sovereign function.
That was the court's interpretation in that particular case.
Wow.
The reasoning was that essential functions, like law enforcement, need a certain level of protection from litigation to function effectively.
But wait, there must be situations where the state's actions, even in these sovereign areas, cross a line, right? What happens then?
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
And this is where Indian courts have started to draw some crucial lines.
Yeah.
They've recognized that even within these sovereign functions, there are limits,
Okay.
particularly when fundamental rights are violated.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not a blanket protection for the state. What kind of cases are we talking about here? Give me an example.
One powerful illustration is the Sahili v. Commissioner of Police case. The Supreme Court awarded compensation to the parents of a child who died due to police brutality.
So even in maintaining law and order, if the state violates someone's fundamental rights, they can be held accountable. That's a crucial distinction.
It is. This case, along with several others, shows that the interpretation of state liability in India is dynamic.
Right.
The courts are constantly balancing the need for the state to operate effectively with the fundamental rights of its citizens.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, isn't it? Protecting individual rights
Exactly.
while ensuring the state can still perform its duties.
Exactly. And as we move on to delve into specific areas like state liability in torts and contracts, you'll see how this balancing act plays out in even more nuanced ways.
All right, this is getting really interesting. Now that we've established the historical context and the tricky concept of sovereign immunity,
Yeah.
let's dive into how this plays out in the realm of torts.
Let's do that. We've seen how the principle of sovereign immunity evolved, but how does that translate into holding the state accountable for those civil wrongs, as we call them in legal terms?
Right. So when someone suffers harm due to the state's actions, where do they stand? Does Article 300, which allows the state to be sued, come into play here?
It does. Article 300 lays the groundwork.
Okay.
However, as we've discussed, the shadow of sovereign immunity still lingers, especially when it comes to those core functions of the state.
Ah, there's that balancing act again. So it's not a straightforward, the state can always be sued for a wrongdoing situation.
Not quite. Indian courts have adopted a nuanced approach.
Okay.
They've recognized that while the state needs a degree of protection to carry out its essential duties,
Right.
it can't be granted blanket immunity, especially when its actions directly harm individuals.
It sounds like there's a constant tension between these two ideas.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of a case that illustrates this?
Definitely. The state of Rajasthan v. Vidyawadi case is a classic example. In this case, a government jeep driver, while on official duty, caused a fatal accident due to his negligence.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty clear-cut case of the state being responsible for the harm caused by its employee.
You'd think so, right? However, the state argued that because the jeep was being used for an official purpose, they were immune from liability. They invoked that sovereign function argument again.
Wow, that seems like a bit of a stretch. Did the courts buy that argument?
They did not. The court held that the state was liable. The driver's negligence wasn't an act of sovereign power. It was simple negligence, just like any other driver on the road could commit.
That's a relief to hear.
Mm.
So this case established that the state can be held responsible for the negligent actions of its employees, even when those employees are performing their official duties.
Exactly. This was a landmark judgment that marked a crucial step away from a rigid interpretation of sovereign immunity in tort cases.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So are there any instances where the state can still claim immunity in these tort cases?
There are some exceptions. Cases that involve what are called acts of state, such as matters of national security or diplomacy, are generally considered outside the realm of tort law.
Okay, that makes sense. I can see why those areas would be treated differently. Holding the state liable in those situations could have serious implications.
Absolutely. But even then, the courts have shown a willingness to step in when fundamental rights are at stake.
Are there any specific cases you can think of where the courts had to intervene in these sensitive areas?
The N. Rao & Co. case is a great example.
Okay.
The state seized a large stock of fertilizer and food grains from a company suspecting some wrongdoing.
Sounds like a standard raid. What was the problem?
The problem was there was no actual wrongdoing.
Mm.
The goods were supposed to be returned to the company.
Mm.
However, by the time the state got around to doing that, the goods had deteriorated significantly and become unusable.
Oh, no.
The company sued for compensation, and the lower court sided with them.
Okay.
But then the high court, citing that sovereign function argument again, reversed the decision,
Oh, wow.
effectively denying the company compensation.
So the company was left to bear the losses. That doesn't seem fair.
Thankfully, the Supreme Court had the final say. They overruled the high court's decision, emphasizing that even when dealing with matters of economic regulation,
Yeah.
a realm often considered sovereign,
Right.
the state cannot escape liability for its negligent actions. They awarded compensation to the company, marking a clear departure from a rigid application of sovereign immunity.
That's a huge win, not just for the company involved, but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation.
Yeah.
It shows that the courts are taking a broader view of state responsibility.
Precisely. This case and others like it reflect a growing understanding that in a modern democracy, the state's power must be balanced with a strong sense of accountability.
And that accountability is further reinforced when we consider the specific rules that govern the state's actions, particularly when entering into contracts. Shall we delve into that next?
Absolutely. It's an area where precision and adherence to procedure are paramount.
All right, let's move on to state liability and contracts. I have a feeling this is where things get even more complex.
They can, but the foundation is actually quite clear.
Okay.
Article 299 of the Constitution lays out the rules for how the government enters into contracts.
Okay.
The crucial point here is that for a contract to be valid,
Right.
it must be executed in the name of the president or the governor, depending on whether it's the union government or a state government.
That sounds like a pretty important detail.
Yeah.
I imagine this rule is in place to ensure that there's no confusion about who is actually authorized to make agreements on behalf of the state.
You're absolutely right. It's all about transparency and accountability. And the Union of India versus NKP Ltd case demonstrates just how critical the seemingly minor technicality can be.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about what happened in this case. What went wrong?
This case involved a contract with the Railway Board. On the surface, everything seemed in order.
Yeah.
However, there was one crucial flaw. The contract was signed by the Secretary of the Railway Board, not by the Director, who was the officially designated authority according to the rules.
So a case of the wrong person signing on the dotted line. Sounds like an honest mistake, though.
You might think so, but the Supreme Court didn't see it that way. They ruled that because the contract wasn't signed by the specific authority designated by Article 299,
Right.
it was invalid, period.
Wow, so even if everything else was in order, a technicality like that can completely nullify a contract with the government.
That's exactly what this case highlights. It underscores the strictness with which Article 299 is interpreted and the importance of meticulousness when dealing with government contracts.
I can imagine this being a real headache for individuals and businesses trying to navigate the complexities of government procedures.
Absolutely.
One wrong signature and everything falls apart.
That's why understanding these nuances of state liability is so important.
Right.
This case serves as a stark reminder that the rules governing contracts with the state are very specific.
Right.
And failing to adhere to them can have significant consequences.
So the takeaway here is, dot your I's, cross your T's, and make absolutely sure you have the right persons signing those contracts with the government.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Okay.
And this emphasis on accountability and adherence to the law doesn't end with contracts. It extends to how the state compensates for its wrongs,
Okay.
which is what we'll explore next.
Okay, I'm ready for the next layer of this
Back
deep
next.
dive. Let's talk about state liability and compensatory jurisprudence. What exactly does that mean?
This is where we get to the heart of how the Indian legal system seeks to provide redress for the wrongs committed by the state. It's about ensuring that when the state's actions cause harm, individuals and communities aren't left to bear the burden alone.
So it's not just about acknowledging that the state was in the wrong. It's about taking concrete steps to make things right,
Yes.
to provide actual compensation for the damage caused.
Precisely. And this is where the concept of constitutional torts comes into play.
Okay.
It's a framework developed by Indian courts to address situations where the state's actions have violated fundamental rights, leading to harm.
Constitutional torts. That sounds pretty serious. Can you give me an example of a case that falls under this category?
One of the most prominent cases in this area is Rudal Saw v. State of Bihar.
Okay.
Rudal Saw was wrongfully imprisoned for 14 years, even after being acquitted by the court.
14 years. That's a shocking injustice. What happened?
The Supreme Court, in a landmark judgment, held that the state was liable for this egregious violation of Rudal Saw's fundamental right to liberty. They recognized that simply releasing him wasn't enough.
Right.
He deserved more than just his freedom back.
I can only imagine the trauma of such an experience. So what did the court do?
The court awarded him substantial compensation, not just for the years of his life unjustly taken away,
Yeah.
but also for the mental and emotional suffering he endured.
That's a powerful example of the court stepping in to right a wrong.
Yeah.
So this case established that the state can be held liable for violating fundamental rights, even if there's no specific law in the books covering that exact situation.
Exactly. It set a crucial precedent. The Rudal Saw case solidified the understanding that the Constitution itself guarantees a right to compensation when the state infringes upon fundamental rights.
That's a pretty significant legal development. Are there other cases when this principle has been applied?
Absolutely. The Pim Singh case is another landmark judgment.
Yeah.
In this case, a member of the Legislative Assembly was illegally detained, which prevented him from attending an assembly session.
So his right to participate in the democratic process was directly violated.
Precisely. And the Supreme Court took this violation very seriously. They awarded him what are called exemplary costs to compensate him for the harm caused by this infringement of his fundamental rights.
These cases are really powerful illustrations of how the concept of state liability is evolving in India. It's not just about abstract legal principles. It's about ensuring that individuals have real avenues for redress when the state oversteps its bounds.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
It's about finding that balance between state power and individual rights. And compensatory jurisprudence is a crucial tool in achieving that balance.
This has been incredibly insightful, but before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd like to get a broader perspective.
Okay.
How does India's approach to state liability stack up against other countries? I'm curious to see how we compare globally.
That's a great question. It's fascinating to explore how different legal systems around the world grapple with this complex relationship between the state and the individual.
All right, I'm ready for a whirlwind tour of state liability across the globe. Let's start with the UK. They have something called the Crown Proceedings Act, right?
They do.
Okay.
And it's a pivotal piece of legislation. In
Right.
many ways, it revolutionized how the UK handles lawsuits against the government.
So is it similar to what we have in India? Do they have that same tension between sovereign immunity and state accountability?
There are definitely some parallels, but there are also some key differences. The Crown Proceedings Act essentially abolished the concept of sovereign immunity for most tort claims.
Wow, so you're saying that in the UK, you can pretty much sue the government for anything?
Well, not quite anything.
Okay.
There are still some exceptions, particularly in areas like national security and diplomacy, which we see in many countries.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Those are sensitive areas.
Yeah.
But compared to India's more nuanced approach, where we still grapple with this concept of sovereign immunity,
Right.
it sounds like the UK has taken a much bolder step in limiting the state's protection from lawsuits.
That's a fair assessment. The Crown Proceedings Act reflects a strong commitment to holding government accountable, even for the actions of its individual employees.
Interesting. So how does the U.S. approach this? What's their system like?
The U.S. operates under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which takes a slightly different approach. It's a bit more restrictive than what we see in the UK.
Restrictive in what sense?
While it waives sovereign immunity for certain types of tort claims,
Yeah.
it maintains immunity in other areas,
Yeah.
most notably for what are called discretionary functions of government.
Discretionary functions. Remind me what that means again.
Essentially, it refers to those actions where government officials have to exercise judgment or make policy decisions. For example, if a government agency decides to build a road in a certain location, that decision would likely be considered a discretionary function.
Okay, so if something goes wrong because of that decision,
Yes.
like let's say the road construction causes environmental damage, the government can't be sued.
In many cases, that's how it works.
Okay.
The idea is to protect the government's ability to make policy decisions without the constant fear of litigation.
I can see the logic there, but it also feels like that could be open to abuse. Couldn't the government just classify anything as a discretionary function to avoid responsibility?
That's a valid concern, and there's been considerable debate about how broadly this exception should be applied.
Right.
Ultimately, it falls to the courts to decide whether a particular government action truly falls under this discretionary function exception.
So, to summarize, the UK has a fairly comprehensive waiver of sovereign immunity,
Right.
while the U.S. takes a more cautious approach with specific exceptions carved out. It's interesting to see these different models.
Absolutely. And it highlights the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the question of state liability.
Yeah.
Each country has to find a system that balances the need for government accountability with the practical realities of governing.
Okay, last stop on our global tour, France. What's their system like? I've heard they have a unique approach.
France has a fascinating system rooted in what's known as administrative law.
Okay.
They have special administrative courts that handle claims against the government, separate from their regular court system.
Wow, dedicated courts just for cases against the government.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. So they don't even use their regular judicial system for these types of claims.
That's right. These administrative courts have developed their own set of principles for determining state liability, often based on the idea of risk rather than fault.
Risk, not fault. That sounds different. Can you explain what that means?
In the traditional tort law approach,
Yeah.
the focus is on proving negligence or intentional wrongdoing.
Hmm.
The risk approach, however, acknowledges that certain government activities, by their very nature,
Right.
create inherent risks of harm.
So even if the government wasn't careless or intentionally trying to cause harm,
Yeah,
they can still be held liable
Yeah.
simply because the activity itself was inherently risky.
exactly. A classic example would be the construction of a dam.
Okay.
Even if the government followed all the proper safety regulations,
Right.
if the dam breaks and causes flooding, they could still be held liable because of the inherent risk associated with such a project.
That's a fascinating perspective. It seems like the French system places a greater emphasis on protecting citizens from harm, even in situations where proving negligence might be difficult.
You could say that. It's a system that prioritizes the well-being of individuals and holds the state accountable for the potential consequences of its actions,
Right.
even when those actions are undertaken with the best of intentions.
So we've got the UK with its broad waiver of immunity,
Right.
the US with its more cautious approach,
Yeah.
and France with its unique risk-based system. That's quite a diverse range of approaches.
It certainly is, and it underscores the fact that there's no single right way to address the complexities of state liability.
Yeah.
Each country develops a system that reflects its own legal traditions, political context, and social values.
This global tour has been incredibly eye-opening. I'm seeing how these comparisons can be helpful in understanding India's own journey. It's clear that we're not alone in grappling with these complex issues of balancing state power and individual rights.
Absolutely. And by studying how other countries have tackled the challenges of state liability, we can gain valuable insights into how India's own legal system might continue to evolve in the future.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, from the origins of sovereign immunity to a global exploration of state liability. It's already clear that this is a fascinating and multifaceted area of law.
We have.
Okay.
And in the next part, we'll delve even deeper into specific Indian cases that have shaped this landscape and explore the principles of state liability in action.
Sounds like a plan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritty of how these concepts play out in real-world scenarios.
I think you'll find it both engaging and thought-provoking. After all, these are the cases that shape how justice is served in India and determine how the balance between state power and individual rights is ultimately struck.
Can't wait. Thanks for listening to LexTalks. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into state liability in India.
Welcome back to LexTalks.
In the last part, we journeyed through the evolution of state liability in India, right from the concept of sovereign immunity
Right.
to its application in the context of torts.
Yeah, that's precisely what makes this area of law so fascinating,
Yeah.
It's a dynamic interplay between principle and pragmatism.
Right.
In this part, we'll delve into some landmark cases
Okay.
that demonstrate how these principles translate into real-world scenarios.
Perfect. I'm eager to see how these abstract concepts we've been discussing play out in actual legal battles.
Yeah.
Where should we start?
Let's revisit the N. Nagendra Rao & Co. case,
Yep.
the one where the state seized goods and then failed to return them in a usable condition.
Right, the fertilizer and food grains case.
Yes.
It really highlighted the complexities of state actions in the economic realm.
Exactly. This case wasn't just about awarding compensation. The Supreme Court went a step further and sent a clear message about the boundaries of the sovereign function defense.
They basically said, you can't just hide behind sovereign immunity when your actions are negligent and cause real harm to businesses.
Right. Precisely. The court emphasized that even in areas like economic regulation, the state has a responsibility to act with a certain level of care and competence.
Right.
They cannot escape liability by simply claiming that they were performing a sovereign function.
That's a crucial precedent for anyone involved in business dealings with the state. It sets a standard for accountability.
Yeah.
Do any other cases come to mind that reinforce this shift towards greater accountability?
Absolutely. The Chairman, Railway Board v. Chandrima Das case
Okay.
is a powerful example.
Okay.
This case had a profound impact on our understanding of state liability in cases of custodial violence.
That sounds harrowing. Custodial violence is a serious issue.
Yes.
What were the specifics of this case?
This case involved a woman who was tragically gang raped by railway employees while she was in their custody.
Oh.
This horrific incident occurred in West Bengal, and the case ultimately reached the Supreme Court.
I can only imagine the ordeal she went through seeking justice.
Yes.
Was the court's decision.
The Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment holding the state liable for the actions of its employees. They unequivocally stated that the state has a constitutional obligation to protect the rights of all individuals, including those in custody.
That's a powerful statement.
Mhm.
It implies that the state can't simply wash its hands of responsibility by claiming that those were the actions of rogue employees.
Yes.
They have a duty to ensure that such incidents don't occur in the first place.
Precisely.
Hmm.
The court emphasized that the state's responsibility goes beyond merely investigating and punishing wrongdoers. It includes taking proactive steps to prevent such violations from happening.
So in a sense, this case expanded the scope of the state's duty of care towards its citizens, particularly those who are most vulnerable.
You've got it. The Chandrima Das case was a watershed moment for human rights in India. It set a precedent that the state cannot shirk its responsibility when it comes to protecting citizens from abuse, especially at the hands of its own agents.
These cases paint a stark picture of how state actions, or the actions of state employees, can have devastating consequences for individuals.
Right.
But what about situations where the state's inaction leads to harm? Can they be held liable for that as well?
That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
And it takes us to a slightly different but equally crucial aspect of state liability, the principle of duty of care.
Okay.
This principle plays a crucial role when evaluating state liability for inaction.
I remember we touched upon this earlier, but can you remind me what duty of care actually means in this context?
In essence, duty of care means that the state has a legal obligation to take reasonable steps to prevent harm to individuals. This applies to a wide range of situations, from ensuring the safety of public infrastructure like roads and bridges, to providing essential services like healthcare and education.
So, if the state is aware of, let's say, a dangerous pothole on a busy road but fails to repair it and someone gets injured because of it, could the state be held liable?
Absolutely. That's a classic example of how the duty of care principle works.
Okay.
Of course, to establish liability, you'd have to prove that the state knew or should have known about the danger, that they had a reasonable opportunity to rectify it, and that their failure to do so directly led to the injury.
So it's not just about what the state actively does, but also about what they failed to do when they have a responsibility to act.
Exactly.
The Municipal Corporation of Delhi v. Supogwanti case comes to mind.
Yes.
That involved a building collapse.
You're absolutely right. That case tragically involved a building collapse in Delhi that resulted in several fatalities.
Right.
The building was known to be in a dilapidated condition, and the municipal corporation had received multiple complaints.
So there was clear evidence that the state, in this case, the municipal corporation, was aware of the danger posed by the building.
Exactly. And despite this knowledge, they failed to take any action to address the situation.
Wow.
This inaction has fatal consequences.
That's heartbreaking. What did the court decide in this case?
The Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment holding that the state, specifically the municipal corporation, had a clear duty of care to ensure the safety of its citizens.
Right.
Their failure to act on the complaints and take steps to address the dangerous condition of the building constituted a breach of that duty. And they were held liable for the resulting loss of life.
Wow, so the state's responsibility extends to proactively ensuring the safety of public spaces and taking action to prevent potential harm.
Precisely. The Subagwanti case served as a stark reminder that the state cannot simply turn a blind eye to potential dangers.
Right.
They have an active and ongoing responsibility to protect their citizens from harm.
This is really starting to paint a comprehensive picture of how state liability works in India.
Yes.
It's not just about punishing wrongdoing.
Right.
It's about setting standards for responsible governance and ensuring that the state is held accountable for its actions and, indeed, its inactions.
You've summarized it perfectly. The concept of state liability is evolving.
Yeah.
It's about creating a system where the state's power is exercised responsibly and where citizens have avenues for redress when their rights are violated or when they suffer harm due to the state's negligence.
These cases have been incredibly illuminating.
Yeah.
We've seen how sovereign immunity is being reinterpreted, how the concept of duty of care adds another layer of accountability, and how the courts are pushing for a more nuanced understanding of the state's responsibilities.
Indeed.
Right.
We've explored a wide spectrum of situations, from torts to contracts, from actions to inaction,
Right.
but there's still much to discuss.
Okay.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the practical challenges of enforcing state liability in India
Right.
and discuss the potential future of this ever-evolving area of law.
I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are many complexities and perhaps even some potential solutions that we haven't touched upon yet.
You're absolutely right. State liability is not a static concept.
Okay.
It's a dynamic field of law that is constantly adapting to new challenges and societal changes.
This has been an incredibly engaging discussion so far. Thanks to our expert for shedding light on these complex legal issues.
It's been a pleasure to explore this topic with you. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this legal journey.
Make sure to tune in for the final part of our deep dive into state liability in India. We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis. Welcome back to LexTalks. In the previous parts of this deep dive, we've really dug into the evolution of state liability in India.
We have.
We've explored how the concept of sovereign immunity has been transformed over time.
Yeah.
And examined how the courts are defining the boundaries of the state's responsibility in areas like torts, contracts, and even inaction.
Right.
It's been fascinating to see how this balance between state power and individual rights is being struck.
Indeed. But as with any complex legal concept, the journey from principle to practice is rarely smooth sailing.
Right.
In this final part, we'll grapple with the challenges of actually enforcing state liability in India.
Okay, so let's get real. What are some of the biggest hurdles that individuals and communities face when trying to hold the state accountable?
One of the most significant challenges is the sheer complexity of our legal system.
Okay.
We have multiple layers of courts, a vast and often intricate body of laws and precedents,
Right.
and a bureaucracy that can at times be slow and opaque.
So even if you have a strong case against the state, navigating this intricate legal maze can be daunting.
Precisely. For many ordinary citizens, especially those from marginalized communities who may lack access to legal resources and representation,
Yeah.
this complexity can be a major barrier to justice.
That's a crucial point. It highlights the fact that even when the law recognizes state liability, access to justice might not be equally available to everyone.
It's a critical issue. Ensuring that everyone has equal access to legal recourse, regardless of their background or resources, is paramount to a just and equitable society.
Absolutely. So we have the challenge of complexity and access. What other obstacles stand in the way of enforcing state liability?
Another major challenge lies in the difficulty of proving negligence.
Okay.
In many cases, particularly those involving government policies or complex administrative decisions,
Right.
establishing a clear causal link between the state's actions and the harm suffered can be incredibly tricky.
I see. So even if the state's actions resulted in negative consequences, proving that they were actually negligent in a legal sense is a whole other battle.
Exactly. And this is where the distinction between policy decisions and operational negligence becomes critical.
Okay, remind me again, what's the difference between the two?
Policy decisions involve a high degree of discretion and judgment
Right.
on the part of government officials.
Yeah.
For instance, a decision to build a dam in a particular location would be considered a policy decision, even if that decision has unintended negative consequences.
Right.
Holding the state liable for such decisions is often difficult.
That makes sense. It goes back to that discretionary function exception we discussed earlier.
Right.
But how does operational negligence differ?
Operational negligence, on the other hand, involves situations where the state fails to carry out its functions or duties with the level of competence and care that's expected.
Right.
Think of a poorly maintained government hospital
Yeah.
where patients suffer due to negligence in basic upkeep and hygiene.
Okay, so it's the difference between making a judgment call, even if it turns out to be a bad one,
Yeah.
versus failing to do your job properly.
You've captured it perfectly.
Yeah.
And in cases of operational negligence, proving that the state's actions, or lack thereof, were the cause of harm is often more straightforward.
But I can imagine that there are still many cases where this line between policy decisions and operational negligence can get blurry.
You're absolutely right. And that's where the expertise and judgment of lawyers and judges come into play.
Right.
They have to dissect the specifics of each case,
Yeah.
untangle the complexities, and determine whether the state's actions or inactions were truly negligent in a legal sense.
It sounds like enforcing state liability often hinges on a complex web of evidence, legal arguments, and judicial interpretation.
Precisely. And this highlights the critical importance of having a robust legal framework that clearly defines the boundaries of state responsibility
Right.
and provides avenues for redress when those boundaries are crossed.
So we've talked about the challenges. What about the future? How do you see state liability evolving in India in the years to come? What trends should we be paying attention to?
That's a question that's on the minds of many legal minds today. While predicting the future is always a tricky business,
Right.
there are some key factors that I believe will shape the landscape of state liability in India.
All right, let's hear those predictions. What trends should we be watching out for?
First and foremost, the increasing awareness of human rights and the growing demand for accountability will undoubtedly continue to push for a more expansive interpretation of state liability.
So citizens are becoming more empowered and less likely to tolerate state overreach or negligence?
Exactly. And this shift in public consciousness is likely to influence judicial decisions and lead to a greater emphasis on protecting individual rights.
That's a positive development.
Yeah.
What other forces do you see shaping the future of state liability?
The second factor is the rapid advancement of technology
Right.
and the expanding role of the state in regulating these new technologies.
Okay.
This is going to create both new challenges and new opportunities in the realm of state liability.
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Think about the increasing use of artificial intelligence, or AI, in various sectors, from law enforcement to healthcare.
Okay.
Let's say an AI system implemented by the state makes an error that leads to harm. Who is liable in this situation? The state, the company that developed the AI, or perhaps both.
That's a really thought-provoking question. As technology becomes more integrated into our lives and into the functioning of the state,
Right.
the lines of responsibility will become increasingly blurred.
Exactly. Our legal frameworks will need to adapt to these technological advancements.
Right.
And this will require innovative thinking to determine how to apply traditional principles of liability in these new and complex contexts.
So we have the growing awareness of human rights
Mm-hmm.
and the rapid evolution of technology.
Mm.
Is there a third factor that you see influencing the future of state liability?
Yes, and it's perhaps the most crucial one. The growing recognition that holding the state liable is not enough.
Okay.
There needs to be a greater focus on effective remedies.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that those who have been wronged by the state receive meaningful compensation and justice.
So it's not just about winning legal battles, it's about ensuring that those victories translate into tangible improvements in people's lives.
Precisely. And achieving this requires creative solutions. We might see the establishment of specialized tribunals or courts
Mm-hmm.
to handle state liability claims more efficiently. We might also witness the greater utilization of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms
Right.
to facilitate quicker and more accessible remedies.
It sounds like the future of state liability will involve not just holding the state accountable, but also streamlining the process of providing redress to those who have been harmed.
That's a key insight. It's about moving beyond a punitive approach and embracing a more restorative model, one that focuses on healing and repairing the harm caused by state actions.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered a wide range of topics, from the historical evolution of state liability to the practical challenges and exciting possibilities that lie ahead.
I hope our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of this complex and evolving area of law.
Right.
It's an area that touches upon the very foundations of our democracy and the balance of power between the state and the individual.
It's certainly been an eye-opening journey for me, and I think the takeaway is that while there are undoubtedly challenges,
Yes.
the evolution of state liability in India represents a positive step towards a more just and accountable society.
That's an excellent way to put it.
Okay.
It's an ongoing process. And as future legal professionals, you have the opportunity to play a crucial role in shaping how these principles are applied and how the state is held accountable.
It's a responsibility that I, for one, am excited to take on. Thank you to our expert for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always inspiring to engage in these discussions about the law and its impact on our lives.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on LexTalks. We hope you found this deep dive informative and engaging.
Remember, the pursuit of justice requires constant vigilance and a deep understanding of the law. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep advocating for a more just and equitable world.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for listening to LexTalks. Subscribe and keep learning.